The organizers need to keep more in mind where the players are from and what the actual fan base is.
Thousands of people are standing outside a tennis venue in Rome right now. Not because a match is happening. Not because tickets are being sold. Just standing there waiting because she might walk by. That tells you something the rankings never could. Her name is Alex Eala. She is 20 years old, Filipino, and somewhere in the last 6 months, she has quietly become one of the most watched athletes on the planet. Not because the sport handed her anything, but because an entire nation decided she was worth losing sleep over. And the institutions that run professional tennis are still, somehow, playing catch-up. Let's go back to January, the Australian Open 2026, because that's where this story really cracked open. Before the tournament even began, Eala held a pre-tournament press conference. These things are routine. Journalists sit down, ask some questions, player answers, everyone moves on. Nobody really watches them unless something controversial happens. Eala's drew 171,000 viewers online. Just let that sit for a second. Carlos Alcaraz, reigning French Open champion, two-time Wimbledon winner, considered by many to be the most exciting player in the men's game, drew 29,000. Sabalenka, the defending Australian Open champion, drew 9,000. Eala, ranked outside the top 40, drew nearly 6 times the audience of the best male player in the world for a press conference. That number alone should have set off every alarm inside Melbourne Park's scheduling department. It didn't. On January 16th, Eala was assigned to Court 6 for her first-round singles match. Court 6 holds roughly 1,500 people. What showed up outside it was something else entirely. Melbourne's Filipino community, tens of thousands strong, descended on Melbourne Park that morning. Families who had driven across the city, couples who had taken days off work, fans who had flown in from interstate. The queue stretched hundreds of yards through the grounds. People had been waiting for hours. And when the match started, security began turning people away because there was simply no more space. Inside, 1,500 people watched. Outside, hundreds more stood at the gates of one of the 4 most prestigious tennis tournaments on Earth and were told to go home. Think about what that moment actually represents. The Australian Open had every single data point it needed before that match was scheduled. It knew the press conference numbers. It knew Melbourne had a substantial Filipino diaspora that was mobilizing around this player in a way nothing in recent memory had. It knew the social media attention she was generating was unlike anything a player outside the top 30 had produced in years. And still, Court 6. That is not a logistical failure. Logistics fail when something unexpected happens. This was expected. What failed was imagination, the willingness to look at what was coming and actually respond to it. The fallout was immediate, and it came from voices that don't usually go public like that. On the Tennis Channel broadcast, Martina Navratilova, 18 Grand Slam singles titles, 9 Wimbledon championships, one of the 2 or 3 greatest players the women's game has ever produced, stopped the conversation and said directly that organizers need to keep more in mind where the players are from and what the actual fan base is. She said it on live television during the tournament, calling out a Grand Slam by name. That is extraordinarily rare. These are people who work within the sport, who have relationships with tournament directors, who understand the politics of saying something like that publicly. Navratilova said it anyway. And she wasn't alone. Lindsay Davenport, 1999 Wimbledon champion, former world number 1, said on the same broadcast that Eala, a player from the Philippines, which she called one of the most famous women the country had ever produced in sport, probably needed to be on a bigger show court. On BBC Radio 5 Live, and Keith Aving, Great Britain's Billie Jean King Cup captain, heard about the queues and simply said she couldn't believe them and asked out loud who was on the scheduling team. 3 separate platforms. 3 respected, credible voices. 1 verdict. The decision was wrong, they knew it was wrong, and they said so on the record. The Australian Open's official response was that it would take it as a learning for next year. That phrase, take it as a learning, is one of the most quietly damning things an institution can say. It confirms they were caught off guard. It confirms they underestimated her. And it sets a clock ticking because now there's a very specific moment coming, Australian Open 2027, where either they deliver on that promise or expose it for what it was. But that reckoning is still months away. Right now, the stage is Rome. The Italian Open, the Foro Italico, 91 years of tennis history carved into marble and clay in one of the most beautiful corners of Europe. And the question the sport is quietly asking itself this week is whether Rome learned what Melbourne didn't. Before getting to what's happening there now, you need to understand what Eala walked into Rome carrying. 8 days before the Italian Open began, she stepped off the clay in Madrid after losing 2-6, 1-6 to Elise Mertens. 57 minutes. It wasn't close. It wasn't a match that got away in a tiebreak or slipped in a third set. It was her third consecutive loss on clay this season, and it pushed her back from her career high ranking of 29, reached in March, down to around 44 in the world. Clay had been unkind. The surface rewards a certain kind of patience and construction, building points methodically, retrieving relentlessly, winning through architecture rather than power, and Eala was still finding her fluency in that language. Greg Rosetsky, the 1997 US Open finalist, spoke about her losses on his podcast and put it well. He said this is part of the learning experience, that she's too good a player to stay stuck. That the bruising losses, the hard weeks, the matches that end before you found your footing, that's the curriculum for someone who's going to be around at the top of this sport for a long time. And here's what actually matters about where she went next. After Madrid, there was an easier option available. The WTA 125 event in Catalonia. A smaller draw, a lighter field, a realistic chance at ranking points she genuinely needed after a difficult stretch. Most players would have taken it. Eala didn't. She skipped it entirely and pointed everything toward Rome. Not because Rome offered a gentler draw. It offered the opposite, one of the deepest fields in women's tennis outside the slams. She went there because Rome was Rome. Because the opportunity to compete at the highest level in front of thousands of people who had already bought flights to watch her mattered more than the safer mathematical choice. That decision says more about who she is than any scoreline ever could. And the people who had already bought those flights, they're worth talking about. There's a woman named V, a Filipina living in Sydney, who traveled to Melbourne for Eala's first-round match at the Australian Open. Not for the tournament. Not for Melbourne generally. Specifically for Eala. One match. When asked why she made that journey, she said that Eala carries the flag and the country proudly, and that this is something that resonates with everyone. That she's becoming a national hero. That people are stopping what they're doing to tune in. Now multiply that by the thousands standing outside the Foro Italico this week. Confirmed reports and videos before the main draw even began documented Filipino fans already gathered outside the venue. Eala was filmed personally thanking fans who had traveled to Italy before she had played a single point. Ticket demand surged. And these were people waiting on a result before committing. They booked the flights when the draw came out, maybe before, because their relationship with this story runs deeper than a ranking or a win-loss record. They were there before the tennis justified it on paper. That's what faith in a player looks like when it becomes something larger than sport. There's a historical precedent for what this can mean commercially, and the tennis world knows it. Li Na won the 2011 French Open and triggered a transformation of the Chinese tennis market that had been years in the making. Before that title, China was a market the sport was trying to access. After it, the WTA's revenue from China became a structural pillar of the tour. One player, one moment, one cultural ignition, and everything downstream changed. People inside the sport have started quietly invoking that comparison when discussing Eala. The Southeast Asian diaspora, spread across Melbourne, Dubai, Riyadh, Rome, Los Angeles, and dozens of other cities where the WTA has tournaments, isn't just fan passion. It's commercial infrastructure. Millions of people who already watch, who already care, who already know her name, waiting for the sport to fully realize what it has. The Italian Open happens to be sitting at the intersection of all of this at a particularly interesting moment for Italian tennis itself. FITP President Angelo Bonaghi has been publicly campaigning for Rome to be recognized as a fifth Grand Slam, a legitimate conversation given the prize money, the history, and the infrastructure the tournament has built. But what makes a Grand Slam isn't just courts and prize money. It's global eyeballs. It's the kind of moment where the entire Philippines goes online on a Tuesday afternoon to watch what's happening in Rome. Eala, whether intentionally or not, has become relevant to that conversation in a way nobody quite predicted. What comes after Rome makes all of this feel sharper. Roland Garros follows almost immediately. The French Open on clay, the surface that's been testing her all season, where she's currently 2-3 in 2026. Then Eastbourne, where she reached the final in 2025, and where her grass court points defense begins. Then eventually, at the end of the road, Australian Open 2027, the institution that promised to take it as a learning, which now has a very specific opportunity to demonstrate what that phrase actually meant. Rome is the first checkpoint in all of that. And right now, before a single point has been played, the scenes outside the Foro Italico are already asking a question of the tournament directors. Because the Australian Open moment, the Court 6 moment, the moment where the queues stretched hundreds of yards and the fans were turned away at the gates, that can't be unseen. Rome watched it happen. The whole sport watched it happen. And now the Foro Italico, with its marble statues and its 91 years of history and its Grand Slam ambitions, has a choice in front of it. The same choice Melbourne had, except without the excuse of not knowing. What makes Eala's story genuinely unusual, beyond the numbers, beyond the crowds, beyond the Hall of Famers speaking up on live television, is the timing of when the people who believed in her decided to believe. The fans who followed her when the broadcasts were unreliable, who tracked scores through the night in Manila, in Los Angeles, in London, when she was playing on courts that held a few hundred people. They weren't chasing a phenomenon. They were watching one build slowly, and they understood what was coming before the rankings reflected it. The 171,000 people who watched her press conference in January weren't reacting to a top 10 ranking or a Grand Slam title. They were simply already there, already certain. And the sport is now, belatedly, catching up to what they knew. The Foro Italico is just the latest venue arriving late to something those fans understood a long time ago. Every match this week, every scheduling decision, every crowd scene outside the gates is going to be a data point in a story.